The ride-hailing app Uber has introduced new rules in Australia and New Zealand. They allow drivers to ban badly behaved passengers. Customers are rated on politeness, punctuality and tidiness. And if the rating falls below 4 stars out of 5, they can find themselves blacklisted. Uber representative Susan Anderson explained the move, which comes into force on September the 19th. She said that the purpose is to create an environment of mutual respect for people who use the service. Anderson added that the vast majority of users have a rating of above 4.5 stars. The new scheme has sparked some strong opinions, though, on social media.
I'm so glad that I'm not an Uber driver, because with some of the stories I have heard passengers pull, I'd probably pull over and beat the out of them.
This should carry to all businesses. Be nice, it's not that hard.
What if Uber discriminates based on gender or race or religion? What if the driver chooses to give passenger a low rating because of their political views? So many things can go wrong here.
So let's get some more opinions on this now and engage in a broader discussion with some guests. First of all, we've got James Farrar. He's the chair of the private hire drivers branch of the IWGB union, and we're also joined by Mohammed Shafiq, chief executive of the Ramadan Foundation. Welcome, gents. First to you, James. What about the risk here of, innocent users being left out in the cold? Maybe a few drivers took exception to them, didn't like how they looked, how they spoke, whatever, and they find themselves unable to get themselves home.
Yeah, well, look, as usual with Uber, there's a real risk here that this is a bit of a PR stunt and that the hype is going to outpace the reality. Now, there is a risk that passengers will lose out. But on the other hand, what we're looking at, at least here in the United Kingdom, is sort of an epidemic of violence against drivers, particularly Uber drivers. So 55% of drivers, we've done a recent survey, 55% of drivers have been physically assaulted on the job. Now the issue here is that on the one hand, if you're an Uber driver, you're a bit safer because only 49% of them have been assaulted compared to 60% of the non-Uber drivers. But the issue then becomes, and that's what's at the heart of this matter, is accountability. Who owns accountability for this type of behaviour in the business? Because when drivers then want to report matters to the police, they find that 75% of them find that 75% of the time that they rarely or never supported by Uber when they want to take a matter in front of the police, compared to 51% of non-Uber drivers. So the issue here is not just about the sort of fickle ratings, it's about real accountability. When something bad happens, who owns the problem and who's going to take this matter to the police or to the regulatory authorities? And that's what we need. We need proper accountability, we need regulatory and police supervision over these public transport services.
Mohammed, what do you make about that point, that hopefully this new system will encourage more accountability? It'll make customers more respectful, and certainly, hopefully, they'll think twice about being perhaps aggressive towards their driver.
I think James is absolutely right. I have many members of my family who are taxi drivers in Manchester and in Bradford and Leeds, and so they sadly suffer violence and racial and religious abuse on daily occasion. And I think you're absolutely right, James, to say that Uber is trying to cop out of this. It's two distinct issues, if I may. The first is around the issue of the safety and support mechanisms in place to protect these drivers. Many of these companies, particularly the multinational companies that we have like Uber and others, actually don't really care about the drivers. They just care about making money. And so when somebody is attacked and needs to access the legal system or report it to the police, there isn't that support there for them. And the other thing is, many of these drivers, may be part of an independent association, but they're not part of trade unions, and they need to be part of trade unions so that they can fight on their behalf. But then I think there's a responsibility on wider society. The aspect of alcohol abuse that goes on when people drink, they use violence and they use hatred, and racism comes out, and xenophobia and sexism. And I do think we need to educate our citizens around how they behave. But then there is also the third aspect, which is if people are left out on the streets, there is more chance of more violence, and vulnerable people could be exploited. So I think it's a really balancing act.
What do you think about the possibility, James, that, you know, drivers might just take advantage of this? Suddenly they'll find themselves with what they perceive as quite a bit of power in their hands, and, you know, personal prejudices can creep into it. Do you think there's any danger there or not?
Well, look, you know, what we need to do is we need to not empower algorithms. We need to empower the driver to make that decision, that gut decision about when they're safe. You know, looking at a fickle consumer rating and using that as a predictor of what might happen, what risk that the driver might face in the future, is like trying to drive with the rear view mirror. And it's not appropriate. You know, part of the job of a driver is dealing with the public, but they have to be empowered to make the decision if they feel that they're not safe taking this ride. And the reality is Uber doesn't let them off the hook. If they do not accept work, they'll find that the algorithm discriminates against them, or they'll be out of a job. That's the real issue. And let's look at the rating system itself. In a recent podcast to drivers, Uber described it like this. They said 1 star is terrible service, 2 stars is bad trip, 3 stars pretty disappointing, 4 stars okay but there was a problem, 5 stars excellent. Now that's a nonsense way to either performance manage a driver or to risk manage the customer. What we need is proper transparency and accountability and regulatory supervision, and that's not what we're getting here with this move from Uber as usual.
Mohammed, what about this? Should actually this be taken a bit further? If there's particularly bad behaviour from Uber users, should the company be perhaps fining them?
I think possibly, but as I said, there is a problem with people who go out on a Friday, Saturday night who then think it's okay to abuse drivers. There are racist xenophobia, there's Islamophobia, anti-Semitic remarks that are made about the drivers, and it puts the drivers at a real disadvantage and at real risk. Every day we hear about drivers who have been attacked and abused, and sadly we are seeing people being killed, taxi drivers being killed in their line of work. And yet these companies, yes, Uber and other private hire companies, are not offering their support to, you know, to the drivers. But I think the other aspect is the local government, the councils who make hundreds of thousands of pounds in fees for licences for the drivers and the badges that people have, the license that they have to be a taxi driver. They make hundreds of thousands of pounds, yet are not investing in protecting drivers and doing whatever they can to support them. And I think if you're able to do all of that, as I've described, then you empower the drivers to make that decision based on how safe they feel about taking customers. And then that is the process of education amongst society.
James talked about protecting the drivers. Yes, I'm just wondering how enforceable is this? You know, one of the criteria is if people are late to arrive for their taxi, which I'm sure we've all done, and probably people get quite sloppy in terms of thinking they've got a few minutes leeway. Will we need technology to enforce this, some kind of time tracking tool, and will that be an expense for the driver, for Uber? Who's going to have to pay up?
Well, look, waiting for a passenger is part of a normal part of the business. The real issue here is safety, and Mohammed is absolutely right. The survey I spoke about of our members up and down the country in the United Kingdom is 83% of drivers have been subject to racist and Islamophobic abuse at work. That's just simply unacceptable. And so what we can't have is a sort of a rating system. There must be a cut-off that if you behave that way, that you must be handed over to the police, and Uber must cooperate with that. And by the way, I have a very simple technological fix for safety and for behaviour at work. It's called CCTV, and having it mandatory in the vehicles. And we see up and down the country, whether it's Glasgow, Leeds, Birmingham, and especially here in London, there is little or no appetite amongst the local authorities, the licensing authorities, to deal with safety and to protect drivers and to treat them with respect as stakeholders. And Mohammed is right, they are a cash cow for licence fees, but the regulatory authorities are really only focused on the consumer. And we need to look at both sides of the equation here and make sure that drivers are safe. And if drivers are safe, then they'll deal with everything else, but they must be empowered to make the decisions about what's safe in terms of driving, but also what's safe and not safe in terms of behaviour of passengers. That's the job of a driver. They need to be empowered to do that. We can't hand that off to an algorithm, especially one that's so poorly designed as Uber's is for rating drivers and passengers.
So Mohammed, you know, the focus is on empowering the drivers. Is there a risk, though, that if you can call this a power for the drivers, that personal prejudices might come into it, and some of the drivers might prejudice against their customers based on their own perception of those people.
Yeah, I think that's a real fear, and I think that's where education comes in, and I think it's important that all drivers who work for Uber or other taxi companies receive two very basic courses, one on equality and diversity and unconscious biases, so that you reflect on your behaviour and reflect on the decision-making process. And the other is very much about exploitation, child sexual exploitation, but also general exploitation, the way the drivers are actually a duty of care towards their customers. And I think if you were able to tackle that, get the support from the local authority, and then make those decisions, empowering the drivers to make decisions based on their safety, and the companies protecting their drivers, I think that's really important. Because the worst thing that can happen is somebody says, gets into an argument with a driver and then decides to give you absolutely 1 point, and then what happens is they're abusive towards the driver, racist or religious or sexist abuse towards the driver, and then they go and give a 1 mark, and then the driver actually penalised for that. And I think that's a real fear amongst many of the drivers as well. They don't want to be penalised and taken off track, because if they do, then they won't be able to make a living.
We don't know how this is going to actually play out in reality. How would you feel, James, if you got banned from using the service?
Well, I wouldn't be very happy, but frankly, a lot of our members are being banned from Uber as it is at the moment. Here in the United Kingdom, Uber is very, very worried about losing its license. It lost its license in London, and so it's going to extreme efforts now to try and police the platform and to be seen to police it. So we have a lot of members who are being just slung off the platform for little or no reason, but they have no right of appeal, either with Uber or with the licensing authority. So that's a real issue here, is having accountability, but also having worker rights. Now, the issue of safeguarding its safety is a big issue, because all of these operators, Uber and all the other big operators in the UK, I know of not one that provides any training, let alone safeguarding training. And it's become such a problem that we, as a trade union, we have now had to try and find a way to create our own safeguarding training for our members who are at serious risk on this issue, frankly. And even, it's got so bad that Transport for London will refuse to work with us as a trade union, and they even went out of their way to stop the Metropolitan Police from working with us on safeguarding issues. We found that out through an IPCC complaint we made to the police, and we found it out through discovery that had happened. So we've got a very bad situation here with licensing authorities who want to sort of criminalise and penalise drivers rather than engage and work with them on these safety issues that Mohammed was talking about. That's the problem here, is that there isn't enough empowerment of drivers and enforcement and protection of these drivers. That's what's going to make the real difference in the world. And by the way, also CCTV. We need CCTV in vehicles. Once we know from other transport modes, whether it's on buses or trains, when you put in CCTV, that makes a dramatic improvement in safety for everybody. Now, Uber's a technology company. They could do that tomorrow.
James,
if they wanted to. They could do it more effectively and cheaply than anybody else.
Go ahead,
yes.
Mohammed.
I'm just going to briefly, Neil, just add to what James says. I think the best way forward for drivers to get their rights is for people to join the trade union movement and sign up and be part of a trade union family who will fight for your rights and hold your employer to account. I think that's really, really important as well.
I just wanted to pick up on something that James mentioned, which was when drivers do have grievances and they go to the authorities, that he feels that often they're not being listened to. Now, from what I hear, a lot of Uber drivers, they have to work very long hours. You could argue that sometimes it's endangering the customer, that they're working such long hours and they're getting very little sleep just to eke out a living because of the small amount that they get from that business transaction. And they're such a fundamental part of society these days, with people getting their taxis so quickly on their phones. Why are they not being listened to, given the big part they play in society?
I think because cheap labour can be exploited. It's happened.
In this country.
Sorry, just let Mohammed go first, and then we'll come over to you.
In the United Kingdom here...
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Go on, James. Finish, please.
Well, I was going to say that, I'm the lead claimant in the worker rights case against Uber here in the United Kingdom. That case is 3 years running now, and Uber keeps appealing that case. And all we are entitled to under the law is the minimum wage and holiday pay. but Uber is fighting against us having that. Now, we're also trying to work with councils, including Transport for London, the Mayor of London, for the regulatory authority to step in and do much more to protect workers in this transport system. You know, Frank Field, the MP, the chair of the Work and Pensions Committee here in the United Kingdom, did a report a couple of years ago, and his opinion, his independent opinion, is that Uber labour is sweated labour. And that's the same. We're sweatshop conditions up and down the country in the private hire trade. And the regulatory authorities have done nothing to stamp out, eradicate and protect workers from that level of exploitation. And that needs to change. Our licensing authorities, and this comes from, you know, all political parties up and down this country who are in control of councils, must do more to protect workers from this level of exploitation. And frankly, employment law is just not being enforced. And so workers like the people we represent are having to spend years in employment tribunals just to try and get minimum wage and basic standards of employment.
We've got about 30 seconds left, Mohammed. I just want to give you a
from the
chance
government
to add
to protect
to that point.
everybody.
I would just add that responsibility on regulatory authorities to step up now and protect drivers, because we've had too many cases around the country of people being abused and being spat at and being killed and being seriously injured. So it's really time for those drivers to be protected. And my message to drivers around the world is, if you want your rights and if you want somebody to fight for you, then you need to join a trade union.
Many thanks to you both, gentlemen. My guest, Mohammed Shafiq, Chief Executive of the Ramadan Foundation,
Thank
and
you.
James Farrar, Chair of the Private Hire Drivers Branch of the IWGB Union. Thanks, guys.